Hi folks, so we're going to start Unit 3 Part 2, which is focused more on businesses, business activity and business structures. So if you're a business studies student, which I know several of you are, a lot of these topics you will have probably done in the past. Um, some of them will be new though and a little bit more economics related, but there is going to be a lot of crossover. Okay, so we're going to start off with types of business organisation, and the first activity is to compare the BBC with Marks and Spencer. So this is going to start off with a very similar kind of theme that we've looked at before when we looked at market systems and economic systems. So have a read through these short descriptions of the BBC and Marks and Spencer's, and then we'll have a look at these questions in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you've read these little extracts. If you haven't, pause the video and read them now. So colour the private sector firms should be really straightforward. So which firms are owned by the private sector? So obviously we have got Samsung's private firm, Ford is a private firm, the BBC is not. You've just read that. Okay, the first sentence says it is owned by the state, so that makes it a public sector business. The NHS is the National Health Service in the UK. That is obviously owned by the state as well. Apple private, Unilever private. Unilever is a large conglomerate, makes a lot of products, pharmaceutical type products. Cadbury's private. MI6 is obviously who James Bond works for, and that's a state-owned organisation. And then the MTR is a funny one in that it's part state-owned and part private, okay? But it is fundamentally a privately owned company. I don't know the exact percentage, it's maybe 70% private, 30% owned by the government. Those percentages might not be quite right. That's something you could check if you're interested, okay? So we've got these questions now that are linked to BBC and Marks and Spencer's. So pause the video and just write down a few points. It doesn't have to be full sentences, full paragraphs. So who owns the BBC? Who controls the BBC? How do the aims of the two organisations differ? What markets does BBC what markets do Marks and Spencer operate in? What is the market structure? And which firm has more of an incentive to cut costs and increase efficiency? Okay, so let's talk about these answers then. So who owns the BBC and Marks and Spencer's? Obviously, as we've already said, the BBC is owned by the UK government, and Marks and Spencer's would be shareholders. So that are exchanged. The shares are bought and sold on stock markets. Remember, we talked about stock markets in Unit 3, Part 1. So who controls the BBC? Well, the BBC is controlled by trustees, and in Marks and Spencer's, it would be a board of directors. So when they're talking about a chairman, a board of directors, a chairman, and the deputy chairman and 9 other directors are the senior management team in that organisation. So what markets do Marks and Spencer's operate in? What is the market structure of these? So we're talking about food, we're talking about clothing, we're talking about maybe homeware, we're talking about maybe drink as well, food, drink. And what is the market structure of these markets? I don't really know what I mean by that. They're just privately owned markets with supply and demand like any other market. Which firm has more an incentive to cut costs and increase efficiencies? You can think back to Unit 2 here. Obviously, Marks and Spencer's does because they're profit maximisers. The lower that they can run their costs and the higher efficiency they have, the more profit margin there will be, and the more they can pay their workers, the more they can expand, and the more that they can pay dividends to their shareholders, which is the share of profit that shareholders receive. Okay, so that's just comparing private and public again, pretty straightforward. We've done quite a lot of work on private and public sectors in the past. So let's have a look. So we're looking at business economics, so microeconomics, but it's got a particular name, it's business economics. As I said, there's a lot of crossover with business studies, okay, but it's from a slightly more economicsy point of view, not that that's a word, okay? So a firm is just any business that's ran for the benefit of its owners. Any business that's run for the benefit of its owners, or profit maximising firm. Public sector, we've talked about the public sector, you can do that yourself. And we've also talked to, obviously, we've got all these different types of public sector companies, and obviously they are funded by tax revenue, borrowed money, and obviously you do pay. So if you live in the UK, you pay the TV license, which is almost like a tax to access the BBC. Okay, and if you don't pay that TV license, you would get fined. So obviously we've got the private sector. So these are businesses owned by individuals in order to make a profit or a return. There's lots of examples there. So this is the first new thing that we need to talk about: limited liability and unlimited liability. As I said, if you're a business studies student, you should be very familiar with these terms. If you're not, buckle in, I'm going to talk you through it. It is a little bit complex. So, limited liability. If a firm has limited liability, this means that they have shareholders and that the business has its own legal identity. So what does that mean with its own legal identity? Well, it means that if the business got in trouble, or it ran up any debts, or it owed money to a third party, so it owed money to a supplier, or it owed money to another business, then the debts of the business are the debts of the business. So the owners of the business are not liable to pay those debts. Okay, so I'm just going to simplify that a little bit more. So if you're running a limited liability company, if the business got into debts, all you could lose was the money that you originally invested into that business. You couldn't lose your home, you couldn't lose your personal savings, you wouldn't have to sell your car or anything like that. You would just lose what you invested, because the liability, the risk of liabilities, that's basically debts, is limited. You can only lose what you invested in the business because the business has its own legal identity. So if the business got into debt, it would be the business that's taken to court, not the owners. Okay, so how is that different from unlimited liability? Well, with unlimited liability, that means that the owners are the business. So there is no separation between the owners of the business. So the debts of the business are the debts of the owners. So if the business got into trouble, it ran up high amounts of debt that it couldn't pay off, then the people that they owed the money to, they could request the owners to use their own savings, they could lose their home, they could basically lose everything to pay the debts of the business, because the owner is the business. There is no legal separation. Okay? And that's really important, because we're going to be looking at 4 different business structures. Again, business studies students will know this. We're going to be looking at sole traders, partnerships, private limited, and public limited companies. And sole traders and partnerships have unlimited liability, and private limited and public limited companies have limited liability. The clue's in the name, isn't it? Limited. Okay, so that tells you right away that they have limited liability. The owner is separate from the business. The business has its own legal identity. So if you're walking down the street and you see like Smith & Sons Ltd, that tells you that they are a private limited company. Okay, an Ltd. If you look online and it says Apple PLC, then that tells you that they are a public limited company. And we're going to talk about what that means in another video. Okay, so we're going to talk about sole traders, partnerships, private and public limited companies in another video. Otherwise, this video is going to end up being about an hour long, and it's going to freak you out, and you're not going to watch it all. Okay? So that's going to be it for this video. All I want you to do is the top half of the workbook up to limited and unlimited liability. If you don't understand what I've just said about limited and unlimited liability, Google it, go on YouTube, look for further information. Make sure that you do understand this. It's one of the fundamental ideas of business structures in business studies and in economics. Okay?